Hey folks, Matt Easton here. Now, I see a lot of things written and said about the so-called pipe back blade. First of all, for anyone who doesn't know, what is a pipe back blade? Well, here's an example of a commonly or relatively commonly encountered example of the type. This is the blade that came about in 1821 for the cavalry, 1822 for the infantry, and I should just mention that pipe back blades do appear before that, but I'm going to refer to that in a second. And people, when they often make criticisms of pipe back blades, as I have done myself, are referring to this type of relatively narrow blade. Now, when I say narrow, it's not narrow like a small sword or a rapier, but it is nevertheless narrower than, you know, a tulwar or a cascara or something like this. So it is kind of in the format of what we would generally consider as a 19th century military sabre, which is what this is. This is basically in the format of a light cavalry officer's sword, although this particular example is actually marked to an infantry officer, but that's a tale for another video. Basically, people kind of criticise this blade. It has to be said, kind of rightfully so, compared to the later fullered blades that replaced it, at least for officers. This was never a cavalry trooper's sword. You have to bear this in mind. This was the cavalry officer's sword. And the reason being that, for anyone who's not familiar with it, we've got a rod section down the back, the so-called pipe of the pipe back. It's not hollow or anything like that. It's a solid cylindrical section down the back of an otherwise quite thin and flat blade. Now, what are the advantages? Well, there are a couple of advantages actually of a pipe back blade. One is that you can have a very, very fine cutting edge, but still a good amount of rigidity to the blade and mass to the blade, because you've essentially concentrated the rigidity and the mass at the back, a bit like half of an H-beam, for example, and keeping a thin edge section at the front. So you can actually get a very, very sharp edge and very fine edge geometry, which can, in theory, make for a good cutting sword. And another advantage is the blade overall is quite light. So for the size of the blade, it's actually quite a light blade, okay? Disadvantages are, generally speaking, you've got a rod at the back, which if you're passing through, if you're cutting through a target, is going to cut perfectly well for the first bit of the blade and then meet resistance when it meets that rod at the back of the blade. The other disadvantage is the blades, generally speaking, are a little bit more flexible. Not a huge amount. Some people will say they're a lot more flexible than the fullered blades, which came before and after. That's not really true. It depends largely on the specific example. This is an example, I believe, made by Prosser. It is marked to Prosser, and Prosser were one of the best makers of the day, and you'll see that this is actually a fairly stiff blade. So despite the fact that it's relatively narrow and it is a pipe back, it is fairly stiff. Okay, but it's quite a light blade for its size. It's a full-length 35-inch bladed cavalry sword. So there we go, pluses and minuses, basically like with any sword design really. Now the pipe back was a style of blade that was particularly popular. If we're just talking about militaries for a moment, I'll talk a bit about where they come from in a second. But within European militaries, they were particularly popular in Britain from about the Battle of Waterloo period, from about 1815, unofficially, and then officially from 1821 and 1822, right the way through to 1845. And in 1845, the so-called Wilkinson type blade with a fuller in it, which really is quite similar actually to the troopers' blades, cavalry troopers' blades, came into use in 1845 and replaced this. Now, again, I'm only talking about officers' swords. The troopers' swords, so cavalry troopers, that they were government owned, government procured, government provided to cavalry troopers, that they never owned those swords, they just simply took them out of stores and used them. They always had fullers in Britain. So we're talking about between around 1820 and around 1845-50, these types of blades were used by officers in Britain. But curiously, this pattern of pipe back blade never really caught on in France, but curiously it did catch on in some other European countries, particularly in certain German states, so Prussia, for example. It was quite popular in Switzerland. It was sort of popular in Austria as well. Now, why was that the case? Well, that's kind of complicated, and I don't think anybody knows the full answer. That's not been properly researched at this point in time. But there are a few influences. First of all, it has to be said that Britain and France were the preeminent empires of Europe by this point. After the Napoleonic Wars, really, apart from Russia, the two most powerful nations in Europe at that point were Britain and France. Remember that Italy hadn't unified, Germany hadn't unified. Germany wasn't a country yet, it was just separate states. So yes, Prussia was quite powerful, but not on the same level as Britain and France. And Britain and France, of course, were world empires as well. So generally speaking, we often see that other nations who are looking to develop their own sword designs, in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, they looked to either British sword design or French sword design. And as I've spoken about in previous videos, the way that they chose to go with one or the other, or a combination of the two, was often politically or religiously based. For example, Prussia was no great lover of the French, it has to be said, for obvious reasons, because Napoleon had invaded, and there'd been a long series of wars between Prussia and France, and there would continue to be, as we well know. Whereas Prussia had quite good relations with Russia and Britain. Now that's kind of complicated because Britain and Russia were more or less enemies, apart from being nominally allies during the Napoleonic Wars. Certainly in the empire building game, Britain and Russia were basically enemies, and Britain pretty much always supported the Ottoman Turkish Empire against the Russians, but then the Prussians tended to support the Russians. But then the relationship between Prussia and Britain was fairly good up until pretty much the Franco-Prussian War. So it's very, very complicated, as politics are, so I won't go too far into that, and it's not my specialist topic at all, but really just to point out that sometimes the choice of sword design wasn't just about practicality, it was sometimes about politics, unfortunately. So the Prussians, the Swiss, sometimes the Austrians, did go for pipe-back blades. Now curiously, despite the fact that Britain kind of pioneered the pipe-back blade, at least in Western Europe, in the early part or first quarter of the 19th century, so between about 1815 and 1820, Britain was like the main pipe-back user, and promoted it and made it regulation for officers. The German swords which used pipe-back blades are generally speaking later 19th century. So it's weird because we've got this situation whereby the pipe-back blade was phased out in Britain for various reasons to do with practicality. It was just found to be not so strong, not so robust at thrusting, not so good at cutting. So a new type of full-head blade design came in 1845 by regulation for officers, and this was considered to be a better fighting blade for fighting in India and Afghanistan and China and bits of Africa and everywhere else that the British Empire was expected to fight at that time. The Prussians, curiously, went from full-head blades to pipe-back blades quite late. We're talking about certainly the 1889 pattern cavalry sword has a pipe-back blade. Why that was the case, and the Swiss 1867 pattern has a pipe-back blade as well. So why that was the case, why they decided to go for pipe-backs long after the British had abandoned them, I don't know. Now, I'm going to talk now a little bit about, is the pipe back inherently bad? Well, I've made this argument on forums actually going back more than a decade, but not many people read forums compared to YouTube. So a lot more people will see my opinion now, probably now that I'm making a video about it, than necessarily ever noticed on forums that I was making this 10 years ago. But I would assert that the pipe back blade is not inherently a bad blade design, but it is not a very good blade design. I won't say it's terrible, but it's not a great sword design when applied to a narrow blade. What do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, here is an Indian talwar. Now, no one, I don't think, would say, oh, that Indian talwar is going to be a terrible cutter. I mean, look at the thing, okay? It's this sword, I must add, doesn't belong to me. I'm just about to post it off to America, to my friend Scott Brown in Florida, but I thought I'd quickly use this opportunity because it's a great example of the type to make a video about it before I post it off. Now, this is what some people would call a tegha, actually, rather than a talwar. The dividing line between a tega and a tulwar is different if you talk to different people. I think it was probably different in different parts of India, what they considered a tega and what was a tulwar. But anyway, let's not worry about that for now. It's an Indian sword with a typical-ish sort of tulwar style hilt with a disc pommel. But notice the blade has, if I bring it closer, if we get the light to reflect, a pipe back blade. Now, why does it have a pipe back blade? Well, that's a somewhat complicated question, but the short answer is, in my opinion, the Turks. Okay, so this is essentially a type of blade which is heavily inspired by the Ottoman Turkish Kilic. Okay, now the Kilic is a curved sword with a blade very much like this, usually though with a more prominent yeoman or false edge. This does have a false edge incidentally, but it just doesn't, it just follows the line of the back and doesn't stand proud. But Turkish swords, particularly the Kilic, but also the Yataghan, feature a T-section blade, which essentially is a pipe back. Now, while this is not necessarily rod sectioned at the back, it's flatter than the pipe back we were looking at before, the British one. It's essentially the same thing. It's doing the same thing. So it's creating one half of an I-beam or an H-girder, whichever term you prefer, whereby it's essentially giving mass and rigidity to the blade only at the back, so you can maintain a very thin cutting edge and edge geometry for the whole front of the blade. Now you'll notice that this is a broad and curved blade. So in this case, when the edge penetrates the target, it's got quite a long way to go before it reaches that back rib. Moreover, because it's a curved blade, often you'll be meeting the target obliquely, which means not only is it a long direction in that line, but it's an even longer direction in that line. So in reality, when you're cutting into a target and drawing through and out of it, what will often happen is you'll hit the target, should we say, the opponent's body usually, but let's say the target, you'll hit about there, and in drawing and cutting, the edge will exit about here, where there is no more pipe back. So quite simply, when you're usually hitting a target, you're usually hitting it in the upper half of the blade and very often in the upper third of the blade, and if you're meeting it obliquely, it's going to exit through the target like that. Okay, so in actual fact, the rigidity, the rod up the back, or the T-section up the back, is in a place where it's not going to inhibit cutting in the short term. But the breadth of the blade also means that you've got better cutting capacity in general, and you've got rigidity conferred by the breadth of the blade, not just by the T-section as well. So you can have a very thin section here, but because of the breadth, the total amount of mass in any given section of the blade is still quite a lot. So where did this come from? Well, quite simply, the T-section blade develops, I believe, in around the sort of 16th century, I think, would be a fair point to put it at. You could give examples of T-section blades which go back beyond that, definitely. But in terms of becoming common, certainly within the Ottoman Empire, I think we can say that the 16th century is probably about when it started to come about. By the 17th and 18th century, it had spread right the way over what we might now term the Middle East and North Africa, and that included Persia, and Persia was next to, or in contact, heavy contact and influence with Afghanistan and India. So quite simply, these types of curved swords came into India via Persian and Afghan and other sort of Mughal, essentially, influence and invasions. And they sometimes brought with them this T-section blade, this Yataghan or Kilic section blade. And it's interesting that while the Kilic and the Yataghan are very different weapons, they do share this cross section. So it seems to be something that was really, that the Ottomans really went for, and it was emulated by other cultures that they came into contact with. So there we go. Here we have an Indian sword with what essentially a pipe back blade, and that almost certainly is where the British got the idea from the Turks, and to probably a lesser degree the Persians and the Indians. But why? Well, quite simply, the Turks in particular, although the Persians and the Indians obviously also, were famous for the quality of their swords. Okay, so during the Napoleonic Wars, there was a lot of conflict that happened in Egypt and what was then part of the Ottoman Empire as well, the Balkans and such like, and indeed around the Mediterranean. And so people came into contact with Turkish and Egyptian and North African and Balkan weapons, and it was very common for these very good quality blades to be brought back to Western Europe, and they influenced Western Europeans, particularly of the kind of officer class. Okay, so after the Egypt campaign, for example, it was very common for both British and French officers to start carrying swords which were either bring back souvenirs from that campaign. They were actually Egyptian swords. Sometimes they were Turkish, sometimes they were Persian, or indeed to have their blades remounted with local French or British hilts. So they kept the blades, and some of those blades were woots, incidentally. And of course, it happened with India as well. And we've got the Indian campaigns, for example, against Tipu Sultan under Wellington, in exactly the same time period. So you've got Indian blades as well. So you've got this kind of double whammy effect of blades coming into the British and French and Dutch and other European countries from these areas, from North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, and India. And so they're influencing the types of blades that are being developed in Europe at that time. Now, I'm going to finish off by showing another British pipe back, but of a very different nature. So we looked at this one before, and I asserted that the pipe back's not inherently bad, but it becomes less good the more narrow you make the blade, essentially. And that a lot of that is to do with rigidity, but also cutting capacity. Now, interestingly, if we look at the 1827 pattern naval officer's sword, they look like this. Now, this is a pipe back, but as you can see, it's a very different type of beast. And we've got a few characteristics here which are definitely related to Turkish swords, I believe. Firstly, we've got the rib at the back. Now, the rib at the back, I think, is emulating Turkish swords. And we should mention as well, I mentioned why were those ribbed swords popular in some parts of Germany and in Austria to some degree and in Switzerland? Well, I think some of that is not only emulating British weapons, which we know they did from some of the styles of their guards, incidentally, but additionally, it's influenced by Turkish weapons. And you've got to remember, of course, Turkey is just basically over there as far as people in Austria are concerned. It's really not that far away. And similar thing for parts of Germany as well. So they were in contact with people in the Balkans, for example, who were literally living under Ottoman rule and carrying yataghans and kiliches around. They were carrying Turkish weapons. So, you know, places like Albania were just like over there if you were in Central Europe. So it's quite understandable why they emulated these nice effective swords that they encountered in areas of Ottoman control. But coming back to this British naval sword, so this is the 1827 pattern, but this type of blade actually goes back further. We can find examples of this style of blade on cavalry swords. I do actually own one, but it's packed away at the moment, so I can't show it to you. But on cavalry sword in Britain of the kind of Battle of Waterloo period and a few years before. So from about 1810, 1812, and by 1815 they were not that uncommon, and in this period between 1815 and 1820, before they became regulation, you actually find a fair number of them. They're usually quite high status swords. They were expensive, usually by the top makers of the day like Prosser, and this is actually unmarked because it's been polished. All of the etching's been polished off it, unfortunately, by previous owners, but I believe that this is a Prosser sword for various reasons. It's got all of the hallmarks of a Prosser weapon. It's very broad, very robust. It's actually got a fair weight to it. It's heavier than most fullard naval swords because it's so broad. It's not particularly long. It's only, I think, a 28 or 29 inch blade. But you'll notice this very flared yeoman or false edge at the back. And that is also a characteristic feature often coupled with these fullard blades. Now, why would that be? I believe a lot of people say, oh, it's to increase thrusting capacity and all this kind of stuff. Yes, that's kind of true, but I believe it's about origins. The pipe back comes from emulating Ottoman weapons. What do Ottoman swords have? A big yeoman. So I believe this is all about the inspiration drawn from Ottoman swords, particularly the kilich, and they went, okay, well, we don't want to actually have a Kilich, we don't want to just remake the Kilich, but we want to take some key features from it to hark back to this great sword design. One of those being this back ribbed section, another one being the raised yeoman. So there we go. I hope that's given you some more information about the pipe back blade and also made you look at it in a different way. Pipe backs aren't inherently bad. I've actually got some really nice examples of pipe backs in my collection, and I've had ones that I've sold that are good fighting weapons. There's nothing wrong with them. You've got to remember that British officers were using pipe-backed swords between around 1815, quite commonly, right the way through until about 1850. And there were pipe-backs carried in the Crimean War, the Indian Mutiny, the Sikh Wars, Afghanistan. They were used in some major conflicts. And not all of them performed badly. Some of them performed very, very well. And undoubtedly, like all swords, a lot of it comes down to the quality of the particular sword's manufacture. And a pipe back, you could say, is more vulnerable to poor manufacture because it's quite difficult to make a pipe back blade. It requires quite a lot of skill, quite hard to heat treat it without it warping and all this kind of stuff. But additionally, if you make it too light, you make it too narrow, this kind of thing, you can make it quite rubbish as a fighting weapon quite easily. With a fuller blade, it's harder to get it wrong. But when you make these well, when you get a top quality manufactured example like this example by Prosser, you make it a bit bigger, you make it a bit thicker, a bit heavier, a bit more robust, you do end up with a really, really good fighting weapon with a couple of advantages. For its size, it's quite light, and it has a very fine edge, which is very good edge geometry for cutting. So there we go. Hope it's helped you to look at pipe back blades in a slightly different light. And I would say for anyone who collects swords, when you get pipe backs, they often feel lovely in the hand because they are light and because of the weight distribution in the blade. They feel really, really nice. And it's becomes more easy to understand why people did fall for this design and did want to have their swords made that way, especially when we couple it with the idea of the relationship with the Ottoman Kilich and the design features which were admired in that very famous sword. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the next video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.